Hello and welcome to Fiction Fans, a podcast where we read books and nonfiction too. I'm Lily.
And I'm Sarah, and it is truly a high point of our or my podcasting journey. I'm speaking for Lily too, I assume.
This is correct, yes.
To be welcoming Rob Wilkins onto the podcast to talk about Terry Pratchett, A Life With Footnotes. Rob, thank you so much for joining us.
My absolute pleasure. Lovely, lovely to meet you across the airwaves.
Well, before we get started talking about A Life With Footnotes, what's something great that happened recently?
Wow, what's happened that's great recently? Getting over COVID. That was really great.
Hey,
that was really,
congrats.
Really
yes.
Pouring myself a really long drink just now before I started speaking with you. That was great. So I'm very happy with that. But, you know, I'm using the drink metaphor. I'm a glass kind of half full guy anyway. So everything's great. If you wake up in the morning, that's better than any other alternative. So yeah, I'm happy with the way things are going. But I suppose for me, if I was to pick one thing, The Amazing Morris being longlisted for the BAFTA, that was...
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's incredible.
It didn't get shortlisted for a BAFTA, but it got longlisted. And I think for a little independent film with a budget that would barely buy the catering on a Pixar film, it's done incredibly well and it's been pitched absolutely right. And in fact, I'll jump straight in. Terry Rossio, the screenwriter, did such an amazing job in adapting Morris. And he grabbed hold of me after he'd watched it for the first time and said, "You might never experience this again. You might never experience the wonder of having such a gorgeous book as The Amazing Morris, adapted by his good self, but adapted so faithfully and then taken to the screen so faithfully." And he's absolutely right. You might never experience that again. So for me, a highlight, it's got to be The Amazing Morris.
I will say, I didn't realize until, I think you have this in a footnote, that Americans and people across the pond pronounce that differently, because I've always pronounced it Maurice.
Well, there you are. Pronounce it wrong as much as you like. No, look, there's almost a bit of a gag going on in the movie that Terry leans into with his screenplay. And I'm very, very happy with that. And I'll play along with it. But between me and you, he's always the Amazing Morris to me.
Well, now I know to correct myself.
But then when you've seen it on the screen, you'll know that he calls himself the Amazing Maurice. So there you go. we can have a bit of fun with the pronunciation on this side and on your side of the Atlantic.
I love it. Well, my good thing is not at all BAFTA related, unfortunately.
Go for it.
But my husband and I have been practicing our very elementary level French. And I've finally discovered a phrase that sounds better in English than it does in French, because we often are talking to our cats, as one does. And mon petit joli chat has nothing on my pretty little kitty, like at all.
No.
The rhyming, the alliteration, so much better in English. So that's makes me a little smug.
That's good, because obviously as an Englishman, I have to believe that everything is better in English than it is in French. This side of the English channel obviously is far superior in every way. I'm joking, listeners. But yes, I do agree with you. There are several things. There's not many things on a menu that sound better in English. I have to concede. But yes, you're absolutely right. And as obviously you know that we are all, anybody connected with the Pratchett estate by default has to be a cat lover. So I appreciate you choosing.
Well, they can't tell the difference, but I'm sure they're not disappointed being shit-talked and sweet-talked in French.
I'm delighted to hear it.
Sarah, how about you? What have you got going on?
My good thing is that I made homemade kimchi.
Oh, jealous.
And I'm very excited for it. I've not had it since I put it in the refrigerator because it has to sit for a little bit, but it looks like it's going to turn out really well. So I'm very pleased.
Hey, I'll have that over the BAFTA.
And so after we're done recording, you will mail both of us a jar. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know how well it would do in the mail, but sure, if you want to get some spoiled kimchi in the mail, I can do that.
It's still a delight for me. I mean, Terry, regrettably, has been gone nearly 8 years, but fans will still send me pickled onions even now. And I think that's a great joy. So some kimchi will make it through the mail, not a problem, I promise you. It will be gratefully received.
So what is everyone drinking this evening? Rob, I heard you poured yourself a nice glass of something.
I have spiced pear liqueur with some prosecco over the top, so just to cool it down and give it a bit of fizz. It's one of those things that still, even here, what are we? Coming to the end of January, and it still feels Christmassy. So there you go. Some spiced pear liqueur with some prosecco.
That sounds delightful.
It's
Absolutely.
really good. It's really good. It was just because both things were open in front of me. There you go.
Well, I would like to lie to you and tell you that I'm drinking Earl Grey because it features strongly in the beverages consumed in A Life with Footnotes. But I'm actually drinking Earl Grey because it's the only black tea I keep in my house.
Got it. I'm very impressed. But are you drinking it with, so you're drinking it black. Do you ever drink it with lemon?
I do occasionally, but in this case, I have made a tea cocktail with a little bit of bourbon.
Now you're talking. That's a good drink.
It's lovely and very warm. It just started snowing for some reason, so I'm protesting with my tea cocktail.
Fantastic.
I'm drinking cider, partially because it also is mentioned heavily in the book, but mostly just because I really like cider.
Good call.
And this is actually a book podcast. Surprise!
Surprise!
Has anyone read anything good lately?
Besides podcasting books.
Yes.
The last book that I actually picked up with the intention of reading cover to cover was actually a book on TV production. So that's a very practical thing. The last work of fiction I picked up was, in fact, Spare, the Prince Harry.
How are you finding it?
It's actually really good. He's got a great story to tell, and he gets it down, whether you are a royalist or not. And I'm sure, being on that side of the Atlantic, I know where you fall. But yeah, it's an incredible story, and I think that for me, I remember the day that he was born, and it was a big deal over here. And obviously, we remember his dear mother incredibly fondly. And so, yeah, if he's got a story to tell, then I think as an Englishman, it's my duty to listen to it or read it. So there you go. So that's the one for me.
I have to be pedantic. My understanding is that is not fiction.
Okay.
No,
okay.
It totally counts for the question. I just wanted to clarify. My understanding is that is in fact nonfiction and not just a bunch of made up stories. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Yeah. I think some readers would disagree entirely.
Okay.
But you are absolutely right.
All right, I'll stop giving you a hard time.
It's nice that you're giving someone else a hard time for a change. Normally she picks on me.
Oh.
That's why we have guests, is to give you a break.
I appreciate that.
With all the talk of vintage sci-fi magazines and early short stories in the book we'll be discussing shortly, I was inspired to dig into my collection of Isaac Asimov science fiction magazines, which I got several boxes of a little while ago. Now, vintage is probably a different definition to me than it is to Terry Pratchett, but they are quite aged at this point. And the one I picked up did feature a story called Adventure Through Time with the Virgin and the Dinosaur. So it's aged a little bit. Well, teeny bit.
Just a little. Okay.
But it was fascinating to see, how sci-fi has changed over the last 20, 30 years.
I, for once, don't have a good answer to this question. I've been doing a lot of podcast reading and not as much personal reading as I sometimes do.
Well, I lied and actually read that short story a little while ago, so...
Still counts.
All right, we have made it to the time everyone has been waiting for. Thank you, Rob, for indulging us. And it's time to talk about A Life with Footnotes.
So before we begin, one of the stories that you tell in this book is you are going through the mail with Terry, and there's a letter from a student journalist who wants to interview him. And she makes the mistake, or maybe she has the brilliant thought that she'll include her phone number. And he immediately picks up the phone and calls her, and she's horrified and unprepared. And I just wanted to say thank you for not doing that to us, because we also probably would have been horrified and unprepared. So
could you imagine being on the end of that call? You are sitting there in your student dorm and Terry Pratchett phones you and says, okay, ask me a question. Nothing like being put on the spot. And obviously he did it on purpose. And whether it means that she went on to edit the Times or whether she gave up journalism that day, I think it will have had some kind of impact. And I know at some point I probably will get a letter from that lady telling me that it either crashed her career or made it. So either which way, I will take the praise or apologize on behalf of Terry.
I mean, regardless of what she has gone on to do, I'm sure it makes for a great story on her part.
You just can't imagine what it would have been like, because he would have been out to get her. So even if she had some great questions, he would have been out to trip her up. Because let's be honest, yeah, Terry was an ex-journalist, but I use the word ex on purpose because I really feel that once he had been tarnished with that particular brush, that it stayed with him forever, and he never lost those journalistic tendencies. So yes, wherever you are, I apologize.
Well, in our defense, I would consider us more of a fanzine than a journalistic enterprise, as long as we're talking about the whole scope of fandom works. So maybe that's a point in our defense. Also, very early on in the book, we find out that the title, A Life with Footnotes, was actually Terry's title for the work.
It was indeed. I was about to say I was stuck for a title. No, I wasn't stuck for a title. I had a couple of working titles, and I think it was always very important for me that there was something that I could pin to the document that I was saving down. And I went through all sorts of play on words, such as A Life Fantastic. Now, I stuck with that one for quite a while, and I was quite happy with that. But A Life with Footnotes actually turned up in the margins of not just the annotated dictations from Terry, dictating to me his content for his own autobiography. It was actually in my notes for it. So I was delighted that I found it there and had written it down, and there it was. And quite seriously, from that day onwards, I did what I never did with Terry. And I just changed the file name instantly, and that was it. It was now going to be that forever. That was it. Because again, I'll tell you a little bit of a secret. When Terry was the guest of honor at Boston Worldcon, the book that they didn't give away. The book they sold in celebration of Terry at the event was Once More with Footnotes, and I will always curse them for stealing such a wonderful title as that. So I was very glad that I could get a title out there with footnotes in, not created by me, but created by Terry. So I was delighted.
And footnotes are such an important part of at least the Discworld novels, as any reader would know.
Yeah.
I was appalled to discover fairly recently, in the grand scheme of things, that there are people who hate footnotes.
Whoa.
Yeah, I don't understand that.
I don't want to know them. They're no friend of mine.
There can't be any overlap with that group of people and Pratchett fans. I just can't imagine that working out.
No. I've always made it very clear for me as a fan and a reader of Terry's work, because let's just establish right now early on in our chats that I am still a massive fan of Terry's work all these years down the line. And for me, the footnote was so important because it was me having a little private moment with Terry, the author, taking me away from the narrative, having a chat in a completely different tone of voice. And I loved that. I loved it. And the other piece of grammar that does it for me exactly the same way is the ellipsis. It just takes you beyond the end of the sentence and gives you a chance to pick up the mug of Earl Grey, have a sip, and have a think about what the author, where he was taking you, and have a little bit of a private moment with him, and know that not every reader is there with you in that moment. And that made it special. But the footnote itself, or even an embedded footnote, a footnote within a footnote, or a footnote within a footnote within a footnote. Now, this is Oscar standard. This is Academy Award level, if you can get it there. But no, I always loved the footnote for that reason. It's you and the author having private time together.
And we get quite a few wonderful footnotes in this biography as well, several of which I won't read them out loud to you because I won't put you through that. I did note several down, though, that I was like, oh, this is a Pratchett footnote, 100% right here.
Good.
Just with tone and pacing and everything, it felt very right.
Thank you. I think it was the very first footnote that is often pointed out to me, is that I take you out of the body of the text. Footnote, Terry loved a footnote, and we come out of it straight away. And That seems to have resonated with the readers. They've got it. They know why I took them there, and I'm delighted that people understand entirely. So yeah, thank you for noticing.
So you talk a bit in this book about your experience working for Terry. What was your favorite bit of working for him? Also, what was the hardest bit?
Okay. The first one, all of it.
Okay, that's fair.
Bar none. Sitting at the coalface every day of my working life while Terry is creating the Discworld novels. Wow. That's walking on the moon for me. That is winning the 100 meters at the Olympics. Anything that you want to paste on it, and then some. So yeah, it was so incredibly important for me to be there with him and just cherish every moment. And I suppose one thing selfishly that I always felt, I'm glad this is happening to me because I know how much I'm appreciating it. If I watched it happen to somebody else, I'd always be worried about whether it meant as much to them as it did to me. So in answer to your question, I can't think that there's not even a top 10 that I could give you of my favorite moments. But sitting at the keyboard and Terry walking through the office door every day and sitting down with a mug of tea in his hand and just going, right, you know how this one goes. And then that's it. He'd just start dictating. And it was just my job to take down those thoughts and try to make some sort of sense of them on the page. What an utter privilege and what an utter joy. And I miss it so much. Just being with him and spending time with him. I can't begin to tell you what a joy. So it's not a cop-out, I promise you, but I couldn't, even if we started talking about the top 100 moments, we'd be here until the morning. I can't do it. I can't do it. It was all wonderful. And he was such incredible company. And a word I was about to use is a word that he would never let me use around him, but he was a genius. And just being around that all the time was it was the best. It was the best. Please don't make me decide.
I suppose, in a sense, you wrote a whole book about the best parts. So,
right, I'm gonna make a note of that. That's my answer from now on. I wrote a whole book about the best parts. There we go. Yes, there's 400 something pages of the best bits. They're all there. So, yeah, thank you. That's actually the answer I should have given you. It's all there within those pages.
Something kind of crazy about this book is that it's really a biography-autobiography hybrid, because you did base quite a bit of it on notes from the subject himself, and then you as the biographer also appear in the text. Was it different writing the parts where you were involved than it was writing the sort of earlier scenes?
Okay, I had at my disposal 20-odd thousand words of Terry's, raw Terry. There it is. And I didn't refer to that in any way when the introduction was written, when we start slipping into chapter 1. But at some point, I'm going to have to. So how am I going to do this? My editor suggested that the first way we would do it, and I like this, is that we would just take Terry's 20-odd thousand words that take us through to the mid-1970s. He's barely become the Terry Pratchett that we know. But what I would do is just put them in verbatim from my documents. And then here's the thing, I would then annotate those in the footnotes. So there we go, A Life with Footnotes. I will now talk to you, the reader, and take you out of Terry's text. But here's a problem, and it's a difficult problem to describe. But I didn't recognize the voice. When I went back to those words, I didn't recognize Terry, my friend. I didn't recognize Terry, the author, when he's dictating the novels to me, sitting with me in full-on work mode. I didn't recognize that. I didn't recognize the authorial voice from the books. I didn't recognize Terry sitting in the house having a cup of tea with his wife. There's no Terry Pratchett that I'd spent time with that I recognized from those words. And yet he dictated those to me. I put them on the page, I tidied them up. And yet when I came to read them a couple of years down the line from his passing, I didn't know where they came from. They didn't sound like Terry. So I know I've wavered slightly from your question, but the difficulty for me was making sure that the readers who knew Terry well would hear Terry's voice. The readers who knew me and knew me well would recognize my voice, but also readers who came to the biography just because they love biographies and they know, hang on a minute, that Terry Pratchett bloke, yep, I know him. I'd love to know more about his life. I don't want to read his novels, but I'm going to read the book. There are people out there who do that. I know there are crazy people. Read all of his novels. But for me, that was the hard part, was trying to find the voice for the book when actually I appear in it. And I hope I have achieved it. And for me, I think the greatest pleasure is people grabbing me by the shoulders and saying, yes, you've brought Terry back to life. And it's like, yeah, job done. That's it. That's it. It's not about me. It's all about Terry. It's all about Terry. If I've done that, that's okay. But if you know me and you can hear my voice coming through the text, then that's a bonus.
You mentioned that you had this, and you mentioned this in the book too, that you had this 20,000 odd word document. But what was your research process like beyond that? Because it didn't sound like it was really all that fleshed out. And as you've just said, it, you didn't recognize Terry's voice in it, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, so for me, it was incredibly simple. My biggest research tool was my own brain. I was incredibly lucky that I had lived through all of that with him,
right?
And so that was the biggest tool that I had to refer to. But having access to Rihanna, Terry's daughter, Lynn, Terry's wife, all of his friends at the Central Electricity Generating Board, I'll get it right, CEGB. They're all wonderful guys. They really are. They shaped Terry into what he became, and various people who had worked with him in the early days. And then, of course, his agent, his original publisher, Colin Smythe, who I'm still incredibly good friends with after all of these years, having access to all of those people who just wanted to tell me their stories. And the most important thing being is that any of them who picked up the book after it's been published, they can flick through, they can search for their names, and they will know that I've been nothing but ultra honest about their contribution to Terry's life. Whether it was a friend from the office or whether it's Neil Gaiman, they will all know that it's just the chats they've had with me. I've been faithful and honest to those discussions. So that's my research material, just knowing all of the right people and having spent a lot of time with all of the right people. They've all been really kind to me.
Are you the luckiest biographer in the world, having all of these just like first party sources?
Can you imagine writing this book without having access to all of those people and to all of my memories? Now, Mark Burrows does it with his book, The Magic of Terry Pratchett. He opens by telling you, the reader, that he never met Terry. So he was a great fan of Terry's work and remains a great fan of Terry's work, but he never met him. But what Mark does is then takes you on the journey of discovering Terry through his own research and his own reading and his own conversations. That in itself is brilliant and is a great read because of it. So both of our books, I feel, they work in unison. That one thing we both love is that we tell the same anecdote on occasions, but from different angles. That Mark will have interviewed somebody who was within the anecdote, and I'm telling the anecdote from Terry's perspective or my perspective. So yes, I am incredibly lucky that I had access to everybody, and everybody was so giving with their time. I mean, one example, Lynn is incredibly private. I see her every day. I will never write down a word of our discussions anywhere without her authority. So when it came to the book, it was actually quite a formal process. It was a formal interview. That we're not talking about the cats, we're not talking about the chickens or the tortoises or the weather. We're talking about Terry. We're talking about you, Lynn, and your relationship with him over the years. And okay, here we go. I thought Lynn would talk to me for maybe 45 minutes, and that would be it. That's all she would have to say formally on the subject. After 5 hours, we realized that we've got to really the end of the working day, and we better pick up this again tomorrow and again the day after. And that was a joy, because having known the family for so many years, and what a privilege that has been to be with them and spend so much time with them over the years. But sitting with Lynn in our library in a formal scenario and hearing anecdotes about Terry for the first time, that was just wonderful. It was wonderful. And maybe 40% of them have appeared in the book. The others are either too personal, or maybe they're not relevant because I've covered them elsewhere. But wow, sitting down with both Lynn and Rihanna and hearing the stories about Lynn's husband, Rihanna's father, as somebody who again is quite happy to call himself a Pratchett fan, what an absolute privilege that was.
This book is only loosely chronological, in that it has many flash forwards and flash backwards sort of interspersed throughout. How did you decide to arrange the content? And I suppose it wasn't written in the order it appeared, since we've talked a little bit about that process. But did you have to go back and look at any timelines like that, or how did that go?
Nope. What you've got is it. I wish I could tell you that there was a great order to things, but as you've said, there isn't and there wasn't. And that's because the chap who I sat next to every day, who taught me what I know, he would basically put a flag in the ground at the beginning of a novel and say, here we go, this is it. And it's a Discworld novel about football on Discworld, and or soccer for your listeners on your side of the Atlantic. And you'll never find two guys who know less about soccer than Terry and myself, but we're going to have a go. And we start writing in one direction, then we start writing in the other direction. We sew it all together at the end. And A Life with Footnotes was very much that. I felt that the introduction, I had to explain why I am me, why I'm here in the room telling you the story that I know of Terry Pratchett. So that's the introduction. That's great. And then we obviously pick up Terry's early childhood and we move on from there. But there was a point in the ground that I knew that I was driving towards. And I've never spoken about this in public, so you've got this one straight from me. I knew the halfway point in the book was Terry sitting under a tree in Roborough in Somerset, and he's just signed a 6-book deal. Lynn comes out with a cup of tea and some lemon drizzle cake and says, "Are you all right, Terry?" And he says, "Yes, Lynn, I think I am. If I carry on like this, I might never need to do a day's work again for the rest of my life." End of part one. Okay. End of part one. At that point, we then turn the page, part two, and flashbulbs, flashbulbs, flashbulbs. We're at a premiere. He's only gone and made it. And I love the contrast between that. And long before they were written, I knew that that's the point I was heading to. And as I was getting to what felt like it would be the halfway point, I was on my hands and knees to the publishers, asking them if they would publish 2 volumes, because I kind of liked that. And I kind of selfishly wanted it because I thought it would be nice to have 2 books and eventually have a slipcase with both of them in. So thinking about the beauty of how that would look on my shelf. But they said no. They said, no, it's got to be 1 book. It's got to be 1 book. But when I got to the end of chapter 20 before the epilogue and did a word count, much to my absolute delight, and this is having Terry Pratchett on your shoulder while you're writing, that the halfway point was about 80,000 words. And by that point, when I got to the end of the book, it was just over 160,000 words, and it was a victory march moment. So in terms of writing, that was one of the definite places that I knew that I was working towards. So if this was a work of fiction, it would still be incredibly important to have those post-it notes on the wall where you feel that you're heading. But obviously, with Terry, we never wrote with that level of order ever. But with A Life with Footnotes, I thought, well, I better. But I only had a couple of post-it notes. Introduction, chapter 1, halfway point, under the tree, and basically the end. That's it. So however difficult that was, we knew that's where I was heading. So at the end of chapter 20, Terry was going to die. And what a terrible thing to be, as I said in the heading for that chapter, the bitter, bitter end. What a terrible thing to be driving towards. So that's as much organization as you get with me. That's it.
Well, I hope that one day we get a special edition that is those 2 volumes in a slipcase.
Do you know, it's funny you should say that, because Dumb Manifesting, the publishing side of our business, we make beautiful books. That's what we do. And the new Discworld Companion, which is a mighty tome illustrated by Paul Kidby and covers what we hope is all of Discworld. I'm not saying that there are any omissions. I'm sure that readers will happily write in to tell me that we've forgotten something crucial, but it's all there within the ultimate Discworld Companion. And because we make lovely books, I've already had the conversation about the leather-bound 2-volume edition. And even if I only ever print 100 of them, it's going to happen because my bookshelves need them. I love lovely books. I love books to read, obviously, but I love books to look at as well. And I think it's very important that the books should be lovely, and they should be like a gorgeous menu that tempts you into ordering the dinner of your dreams. And lovely books do that. And it's very important for me. The quality of the paper, the smell of the ink, the feel of the varnish, the coatings. There you go. I'm talking to you guys. I don't need to convince you this is the right thing to do, because I know you know it as well.
Can you please make sure that when they go up for pre-order, it's at a time that is convenient for those of us on the West Coast?
Okay. It's good to know. Right. Yeah, I promise. Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. So middle of the night for the UK, and then
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
people in the UK will wake up for it. That's fine.
Yeah, it's fine. They'll do that. They'll do that. We won't keep.
I mean, to be fair, I would wake up for it too.
Right.
That I will do, I promise.
Oh, okay. I have to admit, one of my favorite moments in this book was a very visceral memory that Terry had of reading a very specific book, in this case, Lord of the Rings, for the very first time.
Yes.
And I think that's just such a common experience that readers have. You know, you remember an influential book and you can pinpoint the moment that you started reading it, and you have that sort of panorama around you. I was wondering if you have a memory, one of those first read memories that has just stuck with you.
Hell yes. Yeah, absolutely. The Eagle Has Landed by Jack Higgins. It was the first, let me call it, and incorrectly call it, but for the sake of just describing it, the first adult book I'd been given as a child. And there's a whole story I could give you about my love of Jack Higgins novels, and I will not bore you with it on this. When I come back and do this again, remind me to tell you the whole story.
I mean, what I think you're saying is that we should do an episode on a Jack Higgins novel and have you on to talk about it with us.
I would be delighted. Jack, after Terry, Jack would definitely be my mastermind specialist subject. They are boys' own. They're some of them might be considered just a little bit dated now, but as readers, we accept that. A book that's written in the 1970s is not going to be quite as sympathetic to the things that we are nowadays. And if we read them through that lens, then it's fine. It's fine. They are a bit boys' own. But you know what? The Eagle Has Landed. As a child, how old would I have been? 9 or 10 years old. Reading that for the first time, it was incredible. And it was set in a part of the UK. It was set on the East Coast where I grew up. So I was reading about a countryside and a landscape that I knew so well because it was just outside of my bedroom window. And it was just remarkable. And a boat, a motor torpedo boat that my local Cub Scout group owned was actually taken away by Kelso Films, who made the movie. They took it away and they turned it into Kurt Steiner's boat from the novel. So I was immersed in this book. The movie was happening under my nose, and it was so incredibly real for me. And this isn't meant to sound conceited, but because I lived there and I felt part of this great book that went on to sell millions and millions of copies, and it is a great movie. I mean, Michael Caine stars in it. It's just a fantastic movie. I felt if he can do it, Jack Higgins, then I can do it. And it was one of those remarkable moments that the writing felt so accessible to me. It didn't feel beyond my youthful capabilities. But let me tell you that this is also the child who, after he watched Star Wars, went back to his bedroom and wrote the sequel. And then when I watched Empire Strikes Back, realized that George Lucas had actually snuck into my bedroom and stolen my notes because he'd set it on an ice planet. And that was my idea, I tell you. And he nicked it. Now, okay, I can look back now at that 9 or 10-year-old and realize that he was either going to set it on an ice planet or a fiery volcanic planet. And he chose an icy one. But again, it felt for me, through that youthful mind, that if George Lucas can do it and Jack Higgins can do it, well, do you know what? I'm going to have a crack at it. So yes, The Eagle Has Landed. That was the book that did it for me.
Fantastic.
Well, I will make a note of that for our calendar.
You mentioned earlier that in some conversations with Lynn, there were some details and stories that you didn't include for privacy reasons or just for storytelling reasons. Were there any anecdotes that you wish you could have included in the book, but just didn't have the space or the right place for them?
There was that. Even now, I look at it and I'm incredibly proud and pleased of what those 167,000 words contain. And I think it is a fully rounded book and the best that I could have done. And that's all we can ask with anything that we work on. But yeah, there are still things that make me smile. Do not make me tell them to you now.
On the spot, write a sequel now.
Indeed. There's probably not enough for a sequel because, again, when you get to 100,000 words and your publisher gives you the green light to just keep going, and you realize that at 100,000 words, again, Terry's barely Terry. You know, he is a published author at 100,000 words, but he's not the Terry Pratchett that we know really well. When the publisher tells you just to keep going, then you have included just about everything that you can put in there. But every day I think of something else. I think, oh, that would have fitted nicely. But it might have been a slight repeat or just a polish on what we had. The most important thing for me is that anybody who reads it and it was part of one of those anecdotes, they will know that I've been as truthful as I can be, that I've tipped everything into it I can, and that the honesty is the thing that shines from the book. So I've kept nothing in. So yes, there are probably 24 anecdotes I could give you right now, and I'm trying to think. No, don't get me started. Don't get me started.
Well, some of the anecdotes that you do include show a little bit more of an explosive side of Terry, where he's frustrated with some of his criticism that is coming back from editors and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about balancing showing that with showing his like softer side and how he really cared for his fans and everything like that?
I have one useful thing to say about that before Terry passed away, Neil Gaiman wrote the intro for A Slip of the Keyboard, where he tells the reader that Terry Pratchett wasn't the jolly old elf that they might have thought he was. Now, that is the truth. And Neil's intro, I have never been able to read it out loud in public without being overcome with emotion, because it is so accurate and so truthful and such a lovely piece of writing. It's Neil Gaiman, for heaven's sake, of course it's going to be, but it is wonderful, wonderful piece of writing. But the most important thing about it is that Neil sent it to me. The very next morning I went to Terry and I sat down with him and I read it to him, and Terry said, well, I don't think it was quite like that, but go and read it to my wife. And then I went to the house and read it to Lynn, and Lynn said, I suppose he can be a little bit grumpy, which made me laugh. So that's what you're asking me about Terry's slightly abrasive side. But Neil, by writing that intro, he gave me the green light that I could talk about it in greater detail, because that was done in Terry's lifetime. So it's not me being horrible after Terry's passing.
And to be clear, it didn't feel like that whatsoever.
Thank you for that. I'm relieved to hear it, because for me, all I want to do is just give you the rounded picture. The fact that Terry, yes, he sacked me every day, but I also quit every day. And we really should have put a swing door on the chapel onto our writing room to allow both of us to storm out in both directions. But let me tell you, listener, it was always about the work. It was always about the work in progress that we argued about. It was never the fact that my tea's too cold, you didn't get me the right biscuits, or anything like this, or why have we got other colors in the M&Ms other than just blue ones. There was none of that to Terry at all. He was not a prima donna. None of the grumpiness is meant to shine a light on him in any other way than the fact that he was a genius, and therefore everybody in his sphere, including me, was going to frustrate the living daylights out of him. If I've just pointed out to him that he can't do in a short walk what he was hoping to do, that it would in fact have taken a carriage ride halfway across Ankh-Morpork and would have taken the character maybe 30-40 minutes to do it, he's not going to be that happy, because it means that we're now going to have some sort of filler piece going in to correct what we've just done. I would lock horns with him. I would go up against him. But I feel that that's my contribution to the books, Dan. My contribution is the reader not being frustrated that Terry has taken a shortcut just for the sake of speed, of getting the ideas down onto the page. That didn't happen. We would discuss everything. Oh, yeah, there you go. And I miss it. I miss locking horns with him. I miss the cut and thrust of discussing the narrative and pulling apart the narrative and reassembling it and into something better. I miss that.
I have to say, the version of Terry that we see on the page in your book really matches the version that I think we see having written Discworld, just in that this is a person who is extremely critical, but ultimately optimistic.
Yes.
Especially with Discworld and a lot of the commentary that we get in those books. He's not afraid to say some things very truthfully, but at the end of the day is just very optimistic. I already used that word. That's the right word. I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah, it is. I agree with you absolutely entirely. The good in people, if they're a good person, that good will shine through, and that leaps off the page. I think he tells more about the human condition and about human nature, with one foot still firmly balanced on fantasy, the fantasy side of the novels. There's more accuracy and more reality about our own world than if he was writing fiction firmly based in the 20th century or 21st century. And that is one of the reasons why I love the work so dearly, that it is a mirror of our own world, and we see so much through it. But Terry's optimism that the good guys always win, that I love.
Completely. And I think he was able to do so much more because of that mirror.
Yeah.
There's just not as much commentary you can give without becoming insufferable if you're talking about a real world setting.
Oh, yes.
Anyway, this is not Lily gives her great insights into Discworld to someone who already knows them.
Please do. There's nothing I love more than talking about Discworld. I promise you.
Oh, good. We mentioned his softer side that we do see several times. It's extremely heartwarming, the moments we get with him as a husband and a father.
Yes.
But there was one moment, just in a tiny footnote, where he has a stalker whom he takes out to lunch.
Yep.
I'm sorry. That seems like a bad idea to me.
Yeah, I got to that footnote and I was like, what? I mean, this is a very nice gesture, but what?
It's entirely true. I will name her by Christian name only on here, so she knows that I know that she's still out there. Her name was Lydia, and she was German, and she spent a couple of weeks hunting us down to find out where Terry lived, and she was so sweet. She was so sweet. She missed her plane because she'd spending an extra bit of time with Terry, but I imagine it was worth it. But that sums Terry up, that just seeing the good in somebody, that yes, she wanted to hunt him down. She wanted to meet him face to face. But who wouldn't? I wish I could do that. I wish I could do that as she did. There are authors that I would go and knock on their door. I'm very lucky that if I knock on Neil Gaiman's door, I would like to think he would open it and offer me a cup of tea. But to think that Terry did that with Lydia and then took her to the local pub, that's fantastic. And that sums Terry up entirely. Just seeing the good in somebody.
That's just really ballsy. And I just anyway.
More ballsy than I can tell you than I am. I never would have done that. So yeah, I think it's great.
And it worked out well in that instance.
It did.
I guess that's, statistically, I'm sure most stalkers aren't dangerous. I should be fair, you don't use the word stalker in your book, but
I don't.
That's the title I personally am assigning to that situation. So that's me, not anyone else.
Yes. Lydia, if you're listening, we definitely didn't think you as a stalker.
So you talked a little bit about how much insight you had into the writing process and how much involvement you had. And in the biography, I almost called it a novel. Biography.
We're too used to talking about novels.
We get little glimpses of editor notes and times where Terry had to go and rewrite something or change something. Overall, how much did one of his books change from first draft to final draft?
I'll quote Terry at this point. I think it's quite a moment to do so. The first draft is just you telling yourself the story. Okay, so that's the first draft. It was important to Terry to get the story down, the beginning, the middle, and the end, that we now know that there's definitely a story there. And Terry would go back over sentences and make them shine. I attribute this to French polishing. You start with a rough piece of wood and you plane it down, you sand it, you polish it, and you keep polishing until you can see your face glimmering back at you. And that's how Terry worked. He took nothing for granted on the page. So if you were to be handed now a first draft Terry Pratchett novel, it would be everything that you would expect it to be. The story is there. Everything is there. And the best example I can give you of that is The Shepherd's Crown, because if Terry had lived longer, that book would have been, I don't want to say better, but on behalf of Terry, I will say better. It will be better because Terry always said if we worked for another 6 months on any given novel, for whatever reason, and he defined it as thus, he said it would be 3% better. Now, why 3% and not 5% or 3%, I don't know, but let's work on it for another 6 months. So in other words, let's put it down, because 6 months' time, we will have finished the novel after that, or you can keep going on this one and we'll make it 3% better. So the novel for Terry, how much better would it be? Well, that first draft is yourself telling you the story, but you never felt working on a novel that you were redrafting. You always felt that what you were doing was going back in and going, okay, we need a scene between scenes C and D. We actually need to separate those and we need to put something else in. But it would always be new stuff. It would always be wonderful. And so we never had those great rewrites that you imagine there to be. It was never a big deal. Now, on one occasion, we did have to do that, and we had to pull a novel apart, and we had to add an extra day in because we had crammed into 7 days that we described in 6, and it got messy. Technically, it got messy, and we started work at 9 o'clock in the morning, and at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we are still going at it. And I suddenly realized that I hadn't actually stood up for the whole day. I hadn't been to the bathroom. I hadn't had a drink. I had done nothing except sit with a guy who, let's be honest, at that point in his life had a degenerative brain disorder and was scrolling 130,000 words of unseen academicals back through his brain there and back. And he had not broken into a sweat. I gave myself only the second migraine I'd ever had. I stood up from the desk. I went through to the kitchen, made a beeline for the bathroom. I'd been sick. And then Terry came through and said, "Are you all right? You look a bit grey." And he's like, "No, yeah, well, no, yeah, actually, I feel pretty lousy." And Terry's like, "Right, let's carry on. Let's have a drink and carry on." And Terry, with an Alzheimer's diagnosis, could have done another 5 or 6 hours. And that's not exaggerating for a fact. So that's the only one real occasion I could give you where he had to go back in and do some major heavy lifting. On another occasion, it's in the book, but it's definitely a favorite of mine, is that we had finished making money. We'd finished it and we'd sent it off to the publisher. And Jennifer Braille from HarperCollins phoned up 48 hours later and had the usual conversation with Terry that you would expect. Terry's sitting on this side of the Atlantic going, yep, okay, yep, okay. And the phone would go down. I'm like, "Terry, what did you think?" And he said, "I think we've got away with it again." And that imposter syndrome, I promise you, he meant it. This wasn't just for effect. He genuinely meant it. But Jennifer had asked him to write an epilogue, to tie a few things up at the end. And he said that he would, and we would see to it the following day. So my job, managing the writing, is the next day, I'm going to sit Terry down. It's 1,000 words. We'll have it done by lunchtime. He did everything that day other than write. He avoided writing for the whole day. We went off and polished the chickens. We sorted out the tortoises. We went to the garden centre. We did everything other than write. And when we came back, he wanted to go and play the video game of choice, his favourite game, which was Oblivion. He played that. And it was obvious that we were not going to get the writing done that day. So I'm paraphrasing all of this. I tell the whole anecdote in A Life with Footnotes, but just imagine my frustration that not only have we not completed what we promised Jennifer we would complete, we've done no writing at all, which is a rarity. We've played some Oblivion, and the chickens and the tortoises are all very happy, and we've probably got a bag of shopping from the garden centre, but no writing. So I bid him good night. The next day, I walk back into the chapel, and there's a post-it note on the screen saying, "Tidy this up and send it to Jennifer." And I read it, and it was a proper burst into tears moment, because it was perfect in every way. It did everything that Jennifer wanted. It had one of my favorite lines from Discworld in it, and it needed no work. Okay, a light polish just to make it more pleasing to the eye, and that was it. And I sent it to Jennifer. And the next time you read Making Money, and you get to the epilogue, just take a moment to think about the guy who wrote that he wrote that. I checked the CCTV. I left at about 11 p.m. and he left at about 1 o'clock in the morning. So at some point from me departing at 11 and Terry departing at 1 a.m., he was playing Oblivion when I left him. And he, at some point, thought, "I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to write that damn piece now." And sat down, not at his machine, but at my machine, and wrote that. That was genius. And I still hold that up as one of my favorite moments of working with him, of me not being, and I wasn't at the keyboard. So I've waffled on there because there wasn't the great restructuring that you would expect. There was moments like that delivered the most perfect, not rewrite, but the most perfect thing that the editor has asked for. And I can only give you one occasion, and it was with Dodger, where an editor who shall remain nameless gave us 14 pages of notes, which was, nobody gave Terry Pratchett 14 pages of notes. And Terry replied and said, the word you were looking for was "write a better book." And that was it. That was the email that went back. And he wasn't wrong. So yeah, it was a difficult part of the process. And I tell you why. because it was looking back, not looking forward. Everything else we did was looking forward in the writing process. But if we were given too many notes, we felt as if we were then having to reverse and change into a reverse gear. And we didn't like doing that. We want to keep going forward. So if we could work out a solution within the narrative by writing something new rather than getting rid of something old, that was important.
Well, next time we read Making Money for the podcast, which may not be until 2025, actually, at the rate we're going, but I will be thinking about that anecdote when we read the epilogue.
Do, and get me back on and I'll retell the story.
Do you want to come on for every Pratchett episode? I mean, we got time.
Happy. Honestly, call me up. I mean that most seriously. I can talk about Terry, as you have probably noticed, without taking a breath for a very long time.
Oh, goodness. I won't hold you to that, but we might be shooting you an email later.
So you mentioned The Shepherd's Crown, and I wanted to talk about that very briefly because in one of your footnotes, you joke about how spoiler tags hadn't been invented yet. And for the most part through the book, you're actually very, very good at not spoiling any of the major plot points of any of the books, with the exception of Shepherd's Crown, where
and
you
the
do mention
spoiler of them all. Yeah.
Yes. Can you talk about why you ultimately decided to, to heck with it? We're just gonna say this.
I think because it was such an important thing. You see, I'm avoiding talking about the thing now, but it involved Terry's own funeral plans that we were talking about while he was still alive. And I think that's why I did it. It was important for me to let the reader know that particular scene had been written and rewritten because Terry, his health was failing, and every day he felt today would be the day that he needed to write that. So I would allow him, that sounds a terrible thing to say. I would not, I was about to say indulge. It wasn't even indulge. I would just let him go through that process of rewriting that scene over and over again. And I had to live with that. And I thought it was too important not to name it within the biography and say, yep, that's where we were. But that was the reason. It was because it was talking about Terry's own passing while he was still alive. And I was always very uncomfortable with that because I didn't want to think about a life where Terry was no longer with us. And he was happy to talk about it at any time of the day or night. And so, yes, that at that particular point within the book, it was almost to hell with spoilers. I'm just going to throw it in there and just hope that I'm not hated too much for it.
I actually, it's kind of funny because I hadn't read The Shepherd's Crown at that point. Obviously, I owned it, but I was like, I'm not ready to read it yet. And then after reading your book, I went and read it, but I still somehow thought that it was going to be much later in the book. So it still took me by surprise. And boy, the way I bawled when I read that scene, I
read that scene at Terry's funeral, and obviously it completely destroyed me. I read it at the book launch at Waterstones on Piccadilly, and I could hear, while I was reading, I could hear people crying while I was reading, and that was incredibly difficult to get through that. And I am an emotional reader. I read from the heart, not just Terry's work, anybody's work. It gets me right here. And so standing on stage and reading it, standing next to Stephen Briggs and realizing the audience were, with great horror, realizing where Terry had gone with that particular plot line, again, being very careful not to spoil it here. It was, I'm going to use the word devastating because I think we can use that in this case. It was awful, but of course, I had lived it multiple times, and then living Terry's own passing, I felt that the what we had written before he died, it showed how well written that scene was that was written during his lifetime. There it was. I'm trying to be so careful not to spoil it here, and you know exactly what I'm saying, and I don't want to ruin it for anybody else. But yes, it was a flipping tough one. It really was. But can I say right here and now, you've gone on to read it. I still get mail from people saying they can't read Shepherd's Crown because they still want one more Terry book in the canon. And I get that. I do get it. But my response to that now is always, just bloody well read it. Okay, read it. Terry wrote it to be read. Just read it. Because here's the thing. you can go back to The Color of Magic and you can start all over again. And that's the joy. That is the joy of Terry's world. Go back anywhere. And again, I've listened to you both talking about, where do you start with Discworld? Where is the best place to start? Finish Shepherd's Crown and go back to your fun place. Go back to Going Postal. Go back to Unseen Academicals. Here you are, controversial. Go back to Mort. Go back wherever you want to go and pick something up, because you're going to love it as much as you did the first time. You're going to love it again. And that's the joy of it.
And one of the incredible things about his books is that there's so much that you discover on a reread, which you can't say about every single, author's books. But
you sure can't.
Yeah, you sure can't. But it's definitely true about Terry's books.
Your subconscious waking you up in the middle of the night to tap you on the shoulder, to explain a line to you that you missed. And that still happens even now. The other extreme is that people will annotate Terry and they will get it wrong entirely. And they will talk about a South Korean film from the 1940s that Terry was obviously referencing. Like, no, he wasn't. No, he absolutely wasn't. But if people want to believe that, I'm not going to squash that. But I can give you a dozen examples of that, where people feel that Terry was talking about something that they were very familiar with. And Terry was always very gracious to the fans in that respect. And I will be exactly the same person. But Terry was very well read, and he did watch a lot of obscure movies. So he was absorbing things from corners of literature and of movie making and of biographies and everywhere else that I will never, ever, if I did nothing else but read every day constantly for the rest of my life, there will still be things that Terry read that I will not pick up those references. And I love that there's still references hiding within Discworld books that we've all missed. And Terry's looking down on us and he's laughing at our expense. But some of them, the ones the flipping obvious ones on a reread, are still an absolute delight. And that's, again, something that I love about Terry's writing, that you just are always delighted and surprised. And that's wonderful.
I'm so curious about the difference between an American reader's experience and a British reader's experience, just because I know when I read Discworld, there are moments that I'm a monster and I write in books. I've underlined things and then written, this is a reference to something that I don't get. This is clearly a reference. And then I have to go and Google it. And it's like, oh, yeah, literally everyone in England would have understood that. And I just went right over my head.
I do feel, though, that he was generous to his American readers, though. There were a few things that did work in reverse that I think that you needed to have a scholar of American literature to understand a few of the things. And so I'm sure there's Brits out there who go, hang on a minute. What's he referring to? Terry's love of Mark Twain. Now, I know Mark Twain translates all the way around the world and then some, but I know that people who are very well read, who might not have read Mark Twain, and yet there are Mark Twainisms scattered all over Discworld. And again, I love it. So you are more likely on your side of the Atlantic to pick up on those. And that's a terrible generalization, but it's true.
And that's very comforting to know that I'm not the only one missing things.
No, I miss things.
But I'm sure what someone misses is a little different for everyone. And isn't that the wonderful experience of reading? You all get something different.
Yes, absolutely. More so than any other art form, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, I can stand in front of a piece of modern art and accept that I'm not getting it entirely, but I can appreciate for what it is. But with literature, no, it's a different experience for me than it is for you and for everybody else. And I love that. We can talk about it as generally as we are, but it is always going to tick different boxes for each of us in a different way.
One of the recurring themes in A Life with Footnotes is the balancing act that Terry had in between being a very private person, but also a public figure at the same time. And I was wondering what your experience was like writing such intimate content for such a wide audience.
Well, for one, I was never going to write it. I didn't think that I could ever leave those stories out of my head because they are so personal and private. But having read it, I'm sure you will agree that it's not a kiss and tell. It's not an expose. It is the story that Terry would have wanted me to write. So I'm happy with that. But it is so incredibly personal that, yes, it was tough. And trying to balance that with my own desire. I'm not a great internet personality. My profile is because of my work with Terry, and I am incredibly private, and I want to keep myself to myself. Except for when I'm talking about Terry, when we can do it and we can shout it from the top of the Lincoln Memorial, as far as I'm concerned. That's what I've got to balance: my love of Terry's work, my love of Terry, but also that, just keeping my hand on the tiller, that I don't stray too far away. And I think with A Life with Footnotes, I am incredibly pleased that the way it's been received, that people can see the Terry that they knew, however you knew him. If you met him once at a book signing, he is there on the page for you. If you lived with him and were married to him, then Lynn can see Terry there as well. If he is your dad, and only one person in the world can possibly call him dad, and that's Rihanna, she will also see her father on the page. Done. I am delighted that that's the case. I hope that answers the question. It was a difficult process, and it was always going to be a difficult thing to write. And you have to make the decision that you're going to do it. You have to make the decision. And I was so incredibly lucky with the team that I had wrapped around me during the writing process, that they made it so incredibly easy for me. The last 3 chapters in the epilogue were actually written while I was working in Bathgate on Good Omens season 2. So Good Omens is being made just over there, literally just over there. Michael Sheen and David Tennant are doing their stuff on the other side of this wall. And over here, A Life with Footnotes is being finished. The worst 3 chapters, if you like, the chapters showing Terry's demise through the posterior cortical atrophy. So it wasn't a fun process, but it was just wanting to be honest throughout, and just making sure that if I wrote it down, then that from page 1 of the introduction all the way through to the end, that you are comfortable knowing that I'm not going to varnish anything up for the sake of it. It's going to be brutally honest.
Well, I know we definitely appreciated that sort of holistic approach to Terry's life and being able to learn these things. And hopefully it wasn't an emotionally fraught process for you, but how could it not be?
It really was. But again, the beauty and the joy of sending a chapter off to your publisher and worrying for the 10 minutes it would take them to receive that email and read it, skim read it and phone you, and to put your mind at rest. It was brilliant. I was incredibly blessed. There was no better publisher in the world than Transworld. And Larry Finley, who's the managing director of Transworld, took such a personal interest in this book and has been such an incredible friend to me throughout this process. And throughout all of the years I've known him, I've worked beside him for many, many years. He was working at the company when Colour of Magic was first published. He's been around a long time, and he's a true gentleman, and made the process for me so incredibly, incredibly easy through what really should have been a very difficult time. But it was a difficult time. It was just that they held me aloft. And there's so many metaphors we can go for here. They walked ahead of me through the forest with their machetes. They paved the path for me. They did everything that they needed to do to make the process as easy for me as it could be, because it was always going to be emotional. It was never going to be just shot from the hip. It was always going to be difficult because of that honesty. And they were just brilliant.
Well, the final product is just incredible. You did a really, really great job.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was obviously very sad to read it, but it really, really great too.
Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate that. And from you too, that's high praise. So thank you very much.
I did not make a list of all the times I cried during this book, because that's just a downer. But
I cry at the drop of a hat, so it's no surprise that I cried at this book. But
well, then job done. There we go. But don't forget, I shared your tears. I promise you that nothing was flippant. It wasn't put down on the page easily. So I was there sobbing at the keyboard. Believe me.
May I ask, did anyone outside of the sort of editing process read this book before it came out? I know you were working closely with a lot of people in that sphere. I'm just curious.
I know what you mean, and I know the answer that I should give, but really, no, not in terms of, read it and tell me if I've got it right or wrong or whatever. It never actually occurred to me that I should do that, with the exception of my loved ones and Lynn and Rihanna, who I also consider as my loved ones, obviously, because you never want to put something in and you realize, oh my God, it's Lynn and Terry's wedding day, and I've mentioned something that Lynn promised Terry she would never allowed to get out in the public domain. There was nothing like that. There was nothing like that. But you want to make sure that it is intimate, it is personal, and you want to make sure that whoever you are on those pages, that you want them to come across the best person they can be. And I knew that I had written it thus. And so some of the characters I have described as the classic pantomime villain. They walk on the page and you want to boo them, but you're still rooting for them. And at the final curtain, you will still be giving them a standing ovation. And I feel that everybody that was included in the book was very much, they would be applauded in that way. And I think that Terry's pals from the CEGB that I mentioned earlier, his work colleagues, they come across so incredibly well. They are such a wonderful group of guys and girls, and they really are as good natured as they come across on the page. But it didn't occur to me that in any way that they should have some sort of editorial control of what I was saying about them. If they've said it, then that's it. I will write it down.
I was amazed with just how many names were in this book. It made me wonder if I remember my teachers from my youth. I don't think I do. But so many names. Was that just all people remembered those? You didn't have to Google a single thing?
No, genuinely not. No. And people have said to me afterwards that, my God, your memory, but I lived it. So it was just a case of rewinding the tape and just playing again from the start and reliving those moments, and actually sitting at the keyboard with a blank screen in front of you. There's no better way to remember detail than that. And even though the Prince Harry book that we mentioned earlier, the royal family have obviously quite famously said that recollections may vary, I've been delighted that my recollections and my recall of names and places and dates, I'm sure I've made some mistakes. I think it's been pointed out to me that the model of Porsche that I've attributed to Josh Kirby, it was 2 years too early, that Porsche hadn't actually released that model till 1979. So it couldn't have been that year. I'm fine with that.
If that's what people are nitpicking, I think you're doing okay.
It's okay, isn't it? It's okay. But I love the fact that somebody has actually researched that car more. I love my cars and motorbikes. So for me, if I've got a car and a motorbike wrong, I will always be miffed at myself. But that was the type of Googling. But everything else, no, it's my recollections, and then steering other people's recollections, and how wonderful and clear those memories are for everybody. So that here we are with a book where the recollections are like crystal, and that's fabulous. That's so good that nothing is fudged. It's all there exactly as they recalled it to me. Brilliant.
Switching gears just a little bit, you have a delightful anecdote of Terry running a D&D session for his CEGB buddies. Have you ever played D&D? Did you play a session with him at all?
I never played it with him, but but Louis, who is just a couple of rooms away at the moment, has a huge collection of D&D related material, and would have loved to have sat down with Terry to play a game. So no, I didn't. I played Oblivion with Terry, and I modded Oblivion to make the Oblivion experience more Terry Pratchett. So therefore things like crafting and things like that we're seeing in games now that we didn't have, things that Terry would have had but by the roll of a dice a number of years ago, we put that into Oblivion. So the crafting experience all became part of his gaming experience. Do I regret not playing D&D with him? Oh my God, yes. Imagine. Oh yes. How far? Now you've said it, yeah. I'm going to add that to a list of regrets. There we go. I only have a few. That's one of them. But yeah, the CGB guys, when they've talked to me about those D&D sessions, they weren't connected to D&D in the way that we all are. They went along for the ride with Terry. But what you realize that Terry sitting there telling them stories, creating those scenarios, that's what it was all about. That's what it was all about. It didn't matter. Just forget the dice. We don't need to worry about that. We're just going to listen to Terry telling us these things. And knowing now that a lot of Discworld scenarios were created there at the D&D table, that's phenomenal. Terry will tell you about the luggage, how the luggage, that he invented the luggage on the streets of Bath while watching a lady with pulling a suitcase that had a life of its own, a suitcase on wheels that had a life of its own. But the second part of that is that he created the luggage as a D&D character from that, because he wanted something that he could put everything in without it ever being encumbered by weight. And so we created that within Oblivion, that he could carry with him an amulet that would actually protect him from being over encumbered, that he could carry all the gold in the world, all the weaponry in the world, and he didn't consider it cheating because it was an amulet that was giving him all of this power, and all of that relates back to his D&D days. So there you go. Don't get me started on D&D. We'll be talking all night.
Oh, that's a different episode.
Yes.
Well, Rob, you are no novice to the fan convention circuit. I'm sure you're very familiar with the dreaded, this is more of a comment than a question.
Sit down. Could somebody in the back drag them back into their seat?
Who's the moderator here? Too bad, it's me. No, we only have a few. Mostly, wow, how neat. And now we're going to subject you to those.
Go for it.
The comment about the Hogfather, the goal for the Hogfather adaptation to be a household annual Christmas tradition was just so heartwarming and familiar to me, as indeed it is my family's annual Christmas tradition. So that was nice.
I am delighted to hear that. That's warmed me. Thank you for that. I needed that. Thank you.
That was just a comment, not a question. You're welcome.
No, it's great. And it's a good comment. So thank you very much for dropping it in. I needed it.
So back to our actual questions, though. We often have a recurring segment about words that we find weird or that are interesting. You mentioned in this that Terry's favorite word was susurration.
Indeed.
And we were wondering what your favorite word is.
Mellifluous.
It's a good word.
Yeah.
I like how you didn't even have to think about that at all.
No. It's just right there. It's just such a good word. It is everything that a good word should be. It's spelt right. It sounds right. It describes something perfectly. That's a good word. And if Terry's got susurration, I'll have mellifluous.
Normally, when we discuss a book, we ask the question, why should you read this book? Now, obviously, that's not applicable to Discworld novels because the answer is duh. So instead, we ask, when should you read this book? As in, when throughout Discworld should you read this book? And as you know, I'm sure, the starting point for Discworld is a much debated topic.
Indeed.
I was delighted when you recounted that Pratchett himself was dismayed that people start with the color of magic.
Don't do it.
Yeah. Gonna be honest, when I first started reading, did not finish that book and did not pick Discworld back up for a couple years.
See, I hear that all the time, and yet there's a very, very dear friend of mine who no doubt is listening to this, and she would tell you that no, I disagree entirely. Stop talking about colour of magic in that way. It's the perfect place to start. So it's another opinion, and I respect hers greatly. But yes, I am of the camp that don't start there if it does to you what it did to you. Okay. Mm-hmm. So don't do that if it's going to trip you up. If you are not immersed within that, it's not high fantasy, but if you're not immersed in that, it's not going to turn you on. So start somewhere else and you will be gobsmacked and amazed, and you will be delighted at how many novels are ahead of you. And then at some point, go back to Colour of Magic and just see where it all started.
I mean, I really enjoy the Colour of Magic now. I just think personally it benefits from already being fond of the setting, which is maybe unfair.
It is, because at the time of the writing of it, only one person could have had any idea of where it was going, and he didn't have any idea where it was going. So, yeah. And we are now blessed with knowing where it was going because there's 40 other novels ahead of it. So yeah, it's not the easiest place to start, and I will agree with you with that.
It is. I mean, like, I started there. That was my first Discworld book. I read them all in chronological order, but it can be a little difficult as an entry point sometimes. Yes. I think so. Yeah.
Do you have any tips or suggestions for a listener looking to embark on a Discworld journey?
I always feel that going postal is a great place to start, but that's because I was in the office the day that Terry told me that about Moist von Hedwig. And I pointed out to Terry that he couldn't have Moist von Hedwig because of a certain young wizard's familiar. And so 24 hours later, Moist von Hedwig turned into Moist von Lipwig. And again, it's not a small... is it a small spoiler? No, is it? No, I won't go there. Anything I say about Moist is going to be a spoiler, but he's just such a wonderful character. And to know that there were at least probably 3 Moist novels that Terry had on the slate that will never, ever be written. That's, to me, that's a great shame. But read Going Postal, read Making Money, and just imagine for yourself, readers, imagine for yourself what Raising Taxes would have been like, what Running Water would have been like, those other Moist novels, how good they would have been. But yes, okay, let's go with Going Postal. Great place to start.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly. And so I'll stop gloating about that and move on.
Gloat away.
Before we let you go, for listeners, can you tell them where you can be found on the internet?
If you want to be found on the internet.
If you want to be found on the internet, yes.
I hide. The one place I am at is at Terry and Rob on Twitter. And that was our Twitter handle when Terry was alive. And it might be Terry and Rob, and it's just Rob now. But I hang out there and I loiter, but I'm not a great social media person. I feel that A Life with Footnotes has done it for me. That's it. That's every tweet, that's every Instagram post that I could have ever put out there, but it's in book form, and that's how it should be. So yeah, find me at Terry and Rob on Twitter, and that's about it.
Well, and A Life with Footnotes is so much better than a succession of 240 character tweets.
Couldn't agree more.
When we were formulating questions, Sarah, I will attribute this quote to you, to be fair. You referred to Rob's career as a masterclass in writing. And I'm so curious, you have now written a book, and you've been part of writing so many books. You got any more coming for us?
Yes.
Ooh.
Watch this space. What a terrible thing to say. I think Neil has been saying that on repeat whenever anybody asks about Good Omens season 2, and I will do the same. But yes, there is more. There has to be more. My life is constantly busy. There's always so much going on. I co-run the estate with Rihanna, and there is always stuff going on, and it takes a long time to adapt for the screen. So why not toss out a book while you're waiting for things like that to happen, and that's what I'll do, I promise.
Well, I can't wait. Thank you for that sneak peek, and I won't press you on any state secrets.
Thank you.
And on that note, thank you again so much for hanging out with us and giving us a few hours of your evening. This has been incredible.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. What great fun. Thank you. Talking about Terry is one of my greatest joys, and sharing that with you has been brilliant. Thank you both very, very much.
Having you on the podcast really has been a highlight of our podcasting. I don't want to say career, our podcasting journey.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. In the words of Terry Pratchett, what more can a modest man say?
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Fiction Fans.
Come disagree with us. We are on Twitter and Instagram at FictionFansPod. You can also email us at fictionfanspod@gmail.com.
If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and follow us wherever your podcasts live.
Thanks again for listening, and may your villains always be defeated. Bye.
Bye.